the darkest night. I would like to dedicate this tale to anyone gazing upward and wondering why. One day, a papa and his youngest son were walking amidst beauty. They lived in a thick jungle, a lush garden. The tall trees were planted in all directions from their home, and every tree was covered in a blanket of green moss. So no matter where they looked, they were surrounded by the beautiful, natural color of green. And although there were many, many trees, they did not feel like it was a binding space. There were plenty of clearings where ferns and berry bushes grew, and to their delight, all sorts of animals lived in the forest with the family and other forest inhabitants. Wolves and lambs, leopards and goats, lions and calves, all at peace with one another. The animals chirped and howled and sang a wonderful song that filled the forest with serenity. Yet it was not just sight and sound that were pleasant there. It was never hot, and it was never cold. It was never too dry, nor was it ever too damp. Everything was perfect, and the papa and his son and their family and their neighbors and all those who dwelt therein were happy. The papa often took his children for walks about the wondrous forest, where he would teach them about the keeper, the great creator and protector of the forest they lived in. And sometimes the keeper would even walk next to them and talk with them. But often it was just the papa and a child together. One-on-one, he would tell them stories of how the keeper rescued their family. The papa's children listened closely, treasuring their special time together, and would impart his teachings, their testimony, to other children in the forest. The keeper sent his own son, a savior, a Christ, to rescue them from an illness in the wicked land beyond the forest. The cruel country beyond the forest was filled with dragons and warring peoples, each diseased with a plague that rotted their flesh, sin. After their salvation and healing, they, being brought to the wonderful forest, were then tasked to bring forth the green leaves of the land into the wicked and barren country from whence they had formerly come. The papa and his children would often embark on small trips, showing those who dwelt in the other lands the promise of life when following the keeper. For the leaves would heal the ailments of the peoples. They came from the trees of life, which grew in the heart of the forest, their roots drawing water from the river of life, which flowed throughout that blessed land. The forest dwellers could eat of the fruit of the trees and drink of the water freely, so they were never for want, and they were always safe, even when traversing the desert plains beyond. And the papa knew that if they were ever in trouble while out in the barren lands, and if they ever needed aid, the keeper would rescue them. He trusted the keeper of the forest and was grateful to live within his protection, far from the trouble of the desert. Yet that trust was challenged when the papa and his youngest son wandered to the edge of the forest on that fateful day. It had been a quiet day in the forest. The papa and his son woke early, for the keeper had told the papa the night before that he and his son were to go into the desert that day and return in the evening. It was his son's first time venturing beyond the forest. They ate a brief morning meal, gathered their leaves, and strapped two-edged swords to their sides. The leaves are for the people. The swords are for the dragons, the papa said with a proud and excited grin. Ready for their mission, they still took the time to go jovially while they trekked to the forest's edge. They began walking beside a creek that reflected the mingling green leaves and blue sky above. As they walked, the boy asked his papa a curious question. "Papa, why do you love me?" The papa smiled and let out a short chuckle. "Because you are my son," he said gently as he looked down at the boy who was tiptoeing across a log in the water. "I will always love you." They kept walking along the stream, but soon it tapered into dark brown soil, blanketing the forest floor. They could see small roots from the trees running along the shallow water, drinking up as much as they could to give themselves their glorious growth. The sun stepped on the roots, and then tried to climb up one of the younger trees. He slid down shortly after his ascent and landed on his feet. He brushed off his hands, which were now barked and sappy, and asked his papa another question. "If I were lost, would you find me?" He looked up at his papa with his bright eyes and a smile, awaiting a comforting response. The papa laughed. "Yes, of course I would," he exclaimed confidently as he smiled at the sun. The sun looked up at the trees. "But what if, son?" the papa said softly, interrupting him. He knelt, placing his knee on the wet forest floor. He gently put his hands on the son's shoulders and looked into his eyes, the windows of his innocence. "No matter how far you went, or how high you climbed, or how low you fell, I would find you. No matter how dark the night was, or deep your fear was, I would come to you. I would save you." The boy smiled and kissed his papa's cheek. He turned and ran forward. The papa stood and followed his son with great love, still holding the green leaves of the forest. The two went on for quite some time before they reached the edge of the forest. The trees were somber, and just up ahead was the long, dry desert that stretched as far as they could see. The papa remembered his former life living there, a land of pain and drought, where the keeper was not, and the dragons were many. He had been proud to have not raised his son in the desert, and the great green forest gave the papa and his son confidence that they could always return to it when they ventured out into the desert. It stood there like a city, with its walls of green, lit brightly by the sun above and the waters within, showing forth the golden glow of life. "Remember, son," began the papa, "the keeper has us out there today, but just for the day. We will return before the sun falls. I pray, as we venture on the sand, we will only learn to love the forest more." They stepped off the soft, twiggy forest floor and onto the coarse sand, which started abruptly. It was as if the end of the forest was the shore of a great sea of sand. At first, there was a breeze that made the plain bearable. But as the two walked further and further into the dusty desert, they became warm and thirsty. The air was stale, and the wind did not blow, and the sun scorched. As they went, it was hard to remember why they were in the desert. But each time their minds slipped into heated wonder, they could gaze upon the life-filled leaves, which seemed to glow brightly in the dry land around, and remember the glorious forest they were to invite others into. And they could gaze back at the forest to remember it was never too far behind them. So they kept walking, wondering who they might find on their journey. The papa thought of all the foolish and wicked things that took place in the desert and by its people. He comforted himself, knowing the forest was nearby, and that it was his new home. And he knew that he and his son were safe if together, for with the sword at his side, he could protect his son from anything. And he had the leaves of the forest kingdom to offer anyone they saw the proof that true and satisfying life was found only where the keeper dwelt. At first, the sand had been cool in the shade of the forest, but soon each step took them further from the shade and into the sunlight, which seemed to burn hotter as they went. The papa had it in mind to turn back a few times, but his son marveled at the openness and the flatness that desert offered as a sight, and they had yet to see anyone. It was typical to find a wanderer in the desert whenever the keeper sent the papa there. It was as if the keeper had always planned on him finding someone ready to marvel at the green leaves and listen to the great tale of the family's exodus from the barren land. And sometimes the wanderer would take the leaves in hand, and it would heal their flesh, Gloriously they could then come to the forest, eat of the fruit, drink of the water, and live there in harmony with the keeper forever after. Walking on, the son had clearly been pondering a lot that day, for he asked his papa another question. "Papa, does the keeper love me?" "Yes, son," the papa replied confidently. "Yes, he does." "Does he love everyone?" "The keeper tells us he is love," said the papa. "But he hates dragons. He hates the disease that plagues these people." "Is that why he has us come here bringing the leaves?" asked the son. "Because of love and hate?" "Yes, son." Proud, the papa smiled and patted his son's head. He had told his other children this before, yet he never grew tired of talking about the keeper and the forest. "What if they do not come?" asked the son. "What happens to those who would rather live in the desert than in the forest with the keeper?" The papa sighed. "Eventually, the dragons eat them, and sometimes they themselves become dragons." Just then, the boy saw a well not too far off in the distance. There were not any buildings around or signs of people, so it was a strange place for a well. It was a circle of stone stacked almost 2 feet high with no wooden pulley on it. This meant it was an older well and had not been used for a very long time. The son was curious about it, so he ran forward without any sense of worry. The papa kept his steady pace and walked behind his boy. The son arrived at the well alone. It was old and worn down. It looked like years of wind had beat against the stone structure. He leaned over the ledge to look down. It was dark, and he could not see any water. Suddenly, the stone his hand was on slipped off the edge and tumbled to the bottom of the well. The boy fell forward, and his chest struck against even more of those aged rocks. The boy crashed through the top layer of the loose and crumbling stones and tumbled over the edge, falling down the well into darkness. The papa's eyes widened with fright. He felt a tight pinch in his stomach from fear. He ran but could only watch as his son fell. It was like time had slowed, and the papa watched powerless as he fell. He wished to catch his son and keep him from falling and experiencing whatever darkness lay at the bottom of the well, but he was too late. When the papa reached the well, he glanced down. He could not see anything at the bottom, for his eyes were not used to such darkness. "Help, Papa!" the son's voice rang upward. The papa exhaled the breath he had been holding. He knew at least his son was alive. "I am here, son," the papa called, trying to offer whatever comfort he could. He felt useless. He looked around but saw nothing that could help get his son out from the pit. The boy was sitting alone at the bottom of the well. His legs hurt from the fall, and he could feel his heart throbbing within him from fear. "Are you hurt?" the papa asked. "No, I am afraid, Papa." His voice shook as his body trembled. "Son," the papa called, "I do not have anything to lift you out with. You must wait here while I go back to the forest and get the keeper. He is a good keeper of the forest, and he will rescue you if I get him." "Please don't leave me," the son called from below. "There is not anything else I can do." "I must go," said the papa with pain in his voice. "No, Papa, please do not leave me. I believe the keeper will come." The papa sighed and nearly wept. "He is a good keeper," he said to himself. The papa slowly put one leg over the wall of the well and then the other. He was careful to not disturb the stones and lowered himself so that he clung to the edge, dangling himself in the darkness below. Then he let go and fell. He landed on the dry sand below, right next to his son. The life-filled leaves of their home fell graciously next to them. "I will wait right here next to you until the keeper comes," said the papa. The papa propped his little son against the side of the well so he could rest. The depth they were at robbed the sun its power and left an icy, stagnant air for them to shiver in. The
Papa resisted his new dungeon by trying to climb the eroded wall, but to no avail. He slid down the barren walls, returning to the dust below. But it was not just dust that floored the bottom of the well. The darkness had concealed it at first, but with the faint light from the sun above, the sun gasped at a fearful sight. Papa saw it too. Fright gripped them, yet fear irrational. They knew this, for the thing they beheld was dead, but it was terrifying nonetheless. A dragon's skull, sitting at the bottom of the well, their neighbor, half sunken in the dry dirt, glaring at them. The dragon had seemingly perished at the bottom of the well, for the rest of its frame was unseen, long buried by time. The Papa then wondered if the well they had fallen into was no well at all, but rather a grave. Could it be theirs also? Alas, with that frightful thought, the Papa went to his knees, praying and calling out for the keeper to come and rescue them. Hours passed, long hours looking upwards at the ever-fading light. And then, finally, he heard footsteps in the sand above. The keeper had come. The keeper peered into the well. The Papa could see his long, curly white hair neatly combed back. He wore a clean robe and had a thick strand of rope slung over his shoulder. "Keeper," the Papa called, "please rescue us." The keeper looked down with bright eyes and blushed cheeks. He was wrinkled from eternity, yet beautiful in the likeness of one in prime. He let out a short breath from his nostrils and clenched his lips together briefly. And then, meeting the gaze of the Papa, he slowly shook his head. The Papa, awestruck by the denial from the one above, stuttered, But keeper, it is cold and dark and frightful down here. Please rescue us." The keeper leaned over the well, resting his arms on the loose stones, which did not seem to move at all or lose any of their dust. In a warm and gentle whisper, he said, "Not yet." It did not matter if the keeper's voice had been warm. By the time it reached the Papa's ears, it was cold as ice and cruel. The Papa slumped down and sat next to his son. "Papa," the son began in a whisper, "why does the keeper not rescue us?" "I don't know, son." The Papa kept his gaze down at the dark sand beneath his feet, and then his son asked a question that pained him more than anything yet. "Why did you not rescue me?" The Papa felt his chest tremble. He closed his eyes tightly and breathed heavily. He moved forward and sat on his knees. He shuffled around until he faced his son. "Oh, my son," he said quietly. He placed his stiff palms on his son's young cheeks and lifted his head slightly, looking into his fear-filled eyes. I could not. All I could do is wait with you here because I trust that." He stopped himself and looked up. The keeper was looking down, still and unmoving. "Papa?" the son asked after a while in a frail voice. "Does the keeper still love me?" The Papa began to weep, yet he was frozen, staring up at the keeper. He did not shiver nor tremble from the sobbing. His tears merely fell from his still face as he looked upward, truly unaware of the answer to his distressed son's question. If the keeper loved them, how could he let them fall into this pit? And how could he stand by idly while they remained unsaved? The scorching sun sank and darkness began to fall. The Papa learned the sun had offered some power, but then in that dark night there was none. The stones were frosted, and it was all he could do to hold his son tightly so they did not tremble in the cold. All the while the keeper stood above, looking down upon them, and the Papa wished desperately he would do something, anything. The Papa then saw the leaves he had brought with him from the forest laying on the cold ground at the bottom of the well with them. They retained their green even in the darkness, but the Papa then had a cruel thought, or at least he shunned it as cruel, for he thought to himself that those leaves were useless then, and he felt the forest was unapproachable, wondering if he and his son would ever return. As the darkness continued to deepen, the Papa felt his neck stiffen, making it more and more difficult to look up at the keeper. His chest throbbed and his tears continued.
It felt impossible to keep doubt out of his mind. He could not help but doubt the keeper's goodness. How could a good keeper allow them to endure such suffering? With that, the Papa felt a pain on his arm. In the dark, he could behold something like scales growing. He had seen this before many times. Sometimes a desert dweller would have their rotting flesh harden like the scales of a dragon, an even worse ailment to cure. The Papa drew his sword instinctively and sought to cut the scales off, but to no avail. Suddenly, the leaves of the forest glowed brighter. He took as many as he could in hand and gripped his scaly arm with them, praying and sobbing. To his relief, the scales fell off him and his skin was saved. The scales toppled to the well's floor, landing next to the dragon's bones. His skin was smooth, and the pain was gone. He looked up at the keeper then, with ease. His face was briefly lit with green from the glowing leaves below. He wore his smile still, and the Papa was again comforted by it. The sun was only gone for a mere hour before something began to happen above. The ground shook. The sky moved hastily. The Papa could see the keeper's hair start to fall out of place from a strong breeze that began to blow over the top of the well. Gusts of wind with caught-up sand blew over the mouth of the well, lit silver by the night sky. Soon the wind was so strong and the blowing sand so fierce that the keeper faded from the Papa's sight entirely. It was a ceiling of violet sand, blackened by its thickness above. And below, the darkest night had come upon the Papa and the sun, and yet not a single gust of that awful storm reached the bottom of the well, nor did the frigid air above. Indeed, the Papa and his son were safe in that dark pit, and their shivering ceased. As the wind howled, a great and tumultuous howling, filled with crashing as great pillars of airborne sand tore against one another, the tears dried from the Papa's eyes, and he looked down at his son. He was sitting silently, looking up at the dreadful sight above. Even in the darkness, the two could behold the fury and chaos that had become their sky. Shortly after the storm above began, the leaves they had brought with them from the forest became even brighter. They had reminded the Papa and the son of the forest when they were wandering the desert. They had healed the Papa of the scales brought on by doubt, and presently they were the brightest and glorious the Papa had ever seen. While the night was dark, the forest's light remained strong with them. And then, after many hours, the wind slowed, and the sand dissipated. Although the night had passed, the Papa and the son had not fallen asleep. They had remained awake, still and quiet, yet comfortable and safe. As the sand disappeared, the sun began its shining. They could see the keeper had remained at the top of the well, leaning against the stones. His hair and beard were swept up and out of place, and his robe was tattered. He had stood in the middle of that storm throughout all of that dark night. "All right, children," he said in a voice that remained strong. "Now I shall rescue you." The keeper let down the rope he had kept on his shoulder. The bottom of the strand hit the sand just in front of the Papa's knees. He could scarcely believe it. The time had come, and he wished he had never feared nor doubted. Yet he was proven once again to be a weak man with a strong keeper. "Come, son," the Papa said quietly. He helped his son to his feet. The Papa tied a knot at the end of the rope. He then wrapped the rope underneath the son's arms and said, "Put your feet here and hold on tightly." The boy stepped onto the knot and clung to the rope tightly with his hands. The Papa was amazed as he saw his son slowly being raised off the sandy floor of that pit. He watched as his son ascended the dark well and into the arms of the keeper. His little clothes were dirtied, his little sword was covered in sand, but he was safe. And then the rope was thrown down again, this time for him. He took hold of the strong cord, leaving behind him an empty well, save for the green leaves that peppered the dusty ground. They would remain there, full of the unfading life of the forest, as a sign to anyone else who would come by and fall into that well. As with the scales that fell from the Papa's arm, on the dragon bones, ever returning to dust. Reminders that the desert was a place for death and dragons, yet the forest would always stand and its trees never wither, for the keeper himself would sustain them and heal those that come. At last, the papa reached the top, and the keeper helped him over the wall of stone. The day's light was just coming up and felt blinding to him, yet the touch of that rising sun was warmth upon his skin. He felt a thick and strong hand take hold of his own. He looked up, as if he were then a child, and saw the keeper smiling at him. And on the other side of the keeper stood the papa's son, who held onto his other hand. "And children," the keeper said, as he began leading them back to the blissful forest from which they had ventured. Yes, I still love you, because you are my sons. For we know in part, we prophesy in part, but when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know, even as also I am known. 1 Corinthians 13, 9 through 12. You just listened to an excerpt from my new book of Dragons and Men, a Christian anthology on the topics of sin and suffering. The full book is now available for purchase on Amazon and at patreon.com. Links are in the description.